London in winter never changes. The fog creeps down the streets like something rehearsed, dimming the lamps until the city itself feels staged, waiting for an audience to hold its breath. On a particular night in the early 2000s, Christie's, one of the grand auction houses of Piccadilly, stood glowing against the gray. Inside, velvet curtains and polished mahogany whispered of old money. The room was half lit, half shadow, a theater designed not only to sell objects, but to sell the stories that clung to them. Lot 143 was announced without fanfare, a Victorian portrait, unsigned, provenance uncertain. The auctioneer spoke with that studied neutrality of men who sell both Rembrandts and trivialities. But when the attendants wheeled the painting forward, a small murmur stirred through the audience. Even in a place accustomed to treasures, there was something unsettling about it. The portrait showed a young woman seated in a high backed chair, hands folded neatly in her lap.
She wore no jewelry, no crown, no emblem of rank, only a simple gown, ivory in tone, that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. Her eyes were almond-shaped, turned slightly away, as though she resisted the painter's gaze. But what arrested everyone was not her face nor her dress, but the background bossed in a deep crimson, unlike any pigment familiar to the crowd. The red bled outward, surrounding her like a slow fire frozen on canvas. It was not the smooth vermilion of a master's brush, nor the controlled lacquer of a commission piece. It was raw, uneven, almost violent. From certain angles, the paint appeared to glisten as though still wet. It gave the impression of something freshly spilled. No signature, no date, only the gilded frame, ornate but tarnished, and a small brass plate etched with the name it would come to be known by, the Crimson Portrait. The bidding began cautiously. Dealers raised paddles, voices murmured sums, climbed in neat increments. To the catalog, it was an unsigned Victorian work of uncertain provenance, possibly 1870s, 1880s oil, on canvas 76 by 102 cm. Dry language for what looked like the aftermath of a wound, but something more insidious was at work. An undercurrent of unease ran through the room, as though those present were unwilling to look at the painting for too long. Some glanced away, others shifted uncomfortably. It was not simply its artistry or lack thereof, it was that uncanny sensation that the canvas was watching them back. A private collector seated near the front gray suit, narrow spectacles seemed transfixed. When the bidding slowed, he lifted his paddle unhesitating. The price leapt, then stilled. No rival pushed further. With the fall of the gavel, Lot 143 was his. The attendants wheeled the painting away, disappearing behind curtains into the labyrinth of storerooms. The auctioneer moved briskly to the next lot, as if eager to forget it, but the collector could not forget. Weeks later, in his townhouse overlooking Regent's Park, the portrait hung in his study. The house was modern, the furniture sleek, the walls pale. Against this, the crimson portrait looked almost feral, an artifact smuggled from another time. Visitors remarked upon it with politeness, though none lingered in front of it. One evening, as the collector poured himself a drink, his eye caught a strange irregularity along the lower edge of the canvas. He leaned closer. The paint there was thick layered, but under the lamplight he saw something embedded within the pigment, not fiber, not dust, something darker, a fleck that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The collector, a man given to obsession, could not leave it alone. He fetched a magnifying lens.
Under scrutiny, the crimson brushstrokes seemed less like paint, more like dried fluid. He recalled old rumors of artists mixing their own blood into pigments, rituals of authenticity, romantic nonsense. But this seemed more. The unease that had brushed over him at Christie's now took root. He sought expertise. Quietly at first, a contact at the Courtauld Institute agreed to examine a small flake of paint. Weeks later, the results arrived. The pigment was unusual, yes, composed not only of cinnabar and oil, but containing traces of hemoglobin, human blood. The scientist who relayed the finding did so reluctantly, cautioning that contamination was always possible, that samples degrade over time. Still, the implication hung in the air like a noose. If blood was in the paint, whose blood was it, and why had it been used? The collector's dreams began to turn. In them, the woman in the portrait shifted slightly, her head angling further away, her hands tightening in her lap. Once he thought he saw her lips move, though no sound emerged. Another time, her gown, no longer ivory, but stained, blending with the crimson that surrounded her. He woke, sweating, the portrait looming in the dimness. It was only a painting, he told himself. And yet, when he tried to remove it from his study, his hands faltered. Something in him resisted, as if parting with it would mean losing something vital. In the spring, the collector hosted a gathering. Among his guests was an art historian with particular interest in Victorian portraiture. When shown the painting, the historian frowned. Curious, he murmured, the style, brushwork, shading, it's not of a novice, but it is unsigned, which is unusual. Many artists of that period were desperate for recognition. To leave a canvas nameless suggests concealment. The collector leaned forward. Do you recognize the subject? The historian shook his head slowly. She looks familiar, yes, but in that way, faces from old photographs often do, like a ghost of someone we almost know. The collector told him of the pigment analysis. The historian stiffened. There were rumors, in some circles, artists who claimed they could bind a soul to canvas by mixing in life itself. Most thought it theatrics, Gothic flourishes for the salons. But if true, he trailed off. If true, the collector pressed. The historian met his gaze. Then this isn't merely a portrait, it is evidence. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, soft and ceaseless. The portrait sat silent, watching the crimson background glistening as though damp once more. The collector poured another drink, his thoughts racing. He had sought art, perhaps a thrill of possession.
What he had found was something else entirely, a doorway to a century old silence. The portrait was no longer simply a painting, it was a question, and somewhere buried beneath paint and blood, the answer waited. The hidden brushstrokes, the conservatory at the Courtauld Institute, smelled faintly of turpentine and parchment, a place where time slowed to the rhythm of careful brushes and whispered examination. Under the sterile glow of laboratory lamps, the crimson portrait lay flat upon a cushioned table, its gold frame removed, its edges exposed for the first time in perhaps a century. White-gloved hands hovered above it like priests at an altar. The collector stood at a distance, his eyes restless. He had insisted on privacy, no headlines, no gossip for the tabloids. To the staff, this was just another restoration project. But to him, it was more, much more. The conservator, a woman named Dr.
Eleanor Havers leaned closer with a handheld lens, her brow furrowed. See here, she said softly, tracing the edge of the brushstroke. The layering is peculiar. The crimson isn't applied in the conventional manner, it's slashed, almost smeared. And beneath it, there's another color. The collector moved forward. Beneath the violent crimson, faint patches of ochre peeked through. Dr. Havers adjusted the light, and the underpainting revealed itself in fragments, a chair leg, a shadow too sharp, a blur of ivory fabric, an overpainting, she concluded. Something lies beneath. They began the process of infrared scanning, a method that allowed the hidden brushstrokes to emerge like ghosts from the canvas. Slowly on the computer monitor, the image below took form. What appeared was chilling. The woman's face, nearly identical to the finished portrait, but her expression entirely different. Not serene, not passive.
Her eyes, wide mouthed, slightly open as though caught mid breath. Her hands were not folded neatly in her lap, they were raised almost in protest. The crimson that had been painted over her, it obscured more than just background. It covered her throat. The collector felt his chest tighten. The crimson wasn't only backdrop, it was a shroud. Dr. Havers spoke quietly professional, but unsettled. Whoever painted this, they altered her. They tamed her expression, softened her hands, buried her fear beneath blood red paint. Habnarsi Karn. For days, the collector obsessed over the scans. He compared them to the surface painting, tracing the changes. It was as though someone had tried to rewrite her presence, erasing resistance, imposing calm. The very act of overpainting became a kind of violence, but questions multiplied. Who was she? Why had the painter hidden her fear? And most importantly, whose blood had stained the pigment? The collector returned to Christie's pressing archivists for provenance records. The trail was thin, anonymous consigners, sales from private estates. No clear line back to the origin. The only clue was a faded receipt from 1892, listing the item simply as portrait of a lady by unknown hand. But the handwriting on the receipt carried a name in the margin, half erased Ashcroft. Rome, Darzamuri. Ashcroft. The name sent him spiraling into the labyrinth of Victorian art history. In the British Library, under the dim green lamps, he unearthed fragments Arthur Ashcroft painter, active 1860s, 1880s. Few works survived, most unsigned. Critics of the time described him as talented, yet brooding, a man obsessed with capturing truth behind the veil. Then abruptly he vanished from exhibition catalogs. No obituary, no final commission. He simply disappeared. One review dated 1878 mentioned his latest portrait of a young lady unnamed remarkable for its unsettling background tones. The collector whispered the words to himself, "It fit too well." At night, he dreamt again of the woman in the painting. This time she turned toward him, her eyes, pleading lips parted, as though begging him to listen. Behind her, the crimson pulsed like an open wound. He woke, gasping, his sheets damp. The painting loomed across the room, more vivid than ever in the moonlight. He told himself it was only canvas and oil, yet beneath those strokes lay something more, hidden brushstrokes that refused to stay silent. On Smar e ar Asas, Dr. Havers called him back a week later. "We've done further chemical analysis," she said. "I need you to come in." He arrived, breathless, anxious. She handed him a file. "The pigment isn't ordinary vermilion," she explained.
It's cinnabar, yes, but mixed with something else. Proteins, organic matter, strong traces of hemoglobin. The words fell heavy. He had suspected, but hearing it aloud made his skin crawl. You're saying, I'm saying that the crimson contains blood, human almost certainly, very old, but preserved in the binding medium. She hesitated before continuing. This isn't contamination. It was deliberate. Someone mixed blood into the paint.
The collector closed the file slowly, his pulse hammering. He thought again of Ashcroft, the vanished painter, of the young woman's altered expression, her hidden fear, of the crimson that drowned her throat. The portrait was no longer an artwork, it was a confession. But whose, and what had become of the woman, whose face, serene yet silenced, still stared from beneath the crimson veil? The Ashcroft letters. The collector did not sleep much after the revelation.
Every glance at the painting now felt like watching a crime scene preserved in oil and canvas. Each brushstroke seemed alive, each hue whispering a memory no one else could hear. The name Ashcroft had begun to gnaw at him, an itch in the mind he could not ignore. So he buried himself in archives. Days bled into nights within the British Library's hushed halls. Dust clung to his cuffs, ink smudged his fingers, and his eyes grew accustomed to deciphering faded copperplate handwriting. Most files were bureaucratic debris, exhibition lists, society announcements, trivial letters, but then he found something, a bundle of correspondence marked AA tucked inside an unlabeled folder. The letters were addressed to one Clara Whitcomb. The first was dated 1875, the ink blotched but legible. Dearest Clara, I have found my true subject at last.
Her countenance carries the weight of unspeakable truths, and through her my brush has touched something divine, yet she fears her own reflection. She says that to be seen so fully is a terror she cannot bear. I promised her serenity, but art cannot lie. I must decide whether to preserve her truth or spare her torment. The collector's heart pounded as he read. The unnamed woman, it had to be her. The woman behind the crimson. The second letter, dated months later, was darker. Clara, I have painted her anew, but the truth bleeds through no matter how I bury it. The crimson I laid upon the canvas refuses to quiet her. I used what she gave me, her blood, to bind the color. Only then did the painting silence her. The collector's hand trembled. It was a confession in plain ink. Ashcroft had mixed the sitter's blood into the very paint, but the final letter chilled him most. She lingers, not in life, but in pigment. Each night I see her form, her voice, pressed into my dreams.
The portrait is not finished. It will never be finished. She waits for judgment. The collector leaned back in the wooden chair, the letter shaking in his hand. Clara Whitcomb's. Was she a confidant, a lover, or simply the only person to whom Ashcroft dared confess? He returned the next day, demanding every mention of her name in the archives. It took hours, but finally, one thin registry entry emerged: Clara Whitcomb, deceased 1879, cause of death unknown, no obituary, no burial site listed, just silence. I'm going to see. That night, as the collector sat alone in his study, he stared at the crimson portrait. Under lamplight, the woman's eyes seemed to shift again. He thought of Ashcroft's words: she lingers, unable to resist. He retrieved the letters from his satchel and placed them beneath the frame. "Who are you?" he whispered. The glass seemed to tremble. Suddenly he felt a draft move across the room.
The candle flame guttered. His own reflection in the glass appeared distorted, as though another face lingered just behind his own. He turned sharply, nothing but empty air. The following morning, Dr. Havers contacted him again. "I've looked into Ashcroft," she said. "You were right. He disappeared in the late 1880s. No death record, no known descendants, but there's something else." She placed a photograph on the desk. A sepia portrait of Arthur Ashcroft, gaunt and severe, standing beside a canvas shrouded in cloth. His eyes were hollow, his hands stiff at his sides, and there in the blurred background a faint silhouette of a woman seemed to peek from behind the shroud. "Some say he fell into madness," Havers said, "that he believed his paintings trapped souls. He claimed he could preserve not only likeness but essence. Most thought it was eccentricity until his works began vanishing. Collectors destroyed them."
They said the canvases brought ruin to any home they entered. The collector looked again at the photograph. The shrouded canvas, the woman's ghostly outline, and in Ashcroft's eyes, a darkness that seemed to recognize him across centuries. The puzzle was no longer about provenance or art history or even scandal. It was about a man who had painted with blood a woman erased beneath crimson and the whispers of a presence that refused to die. The collector folded the letters carefully, slid them back into his satchel, and tightened the locks on his study. Yet even as he extinguished the lamps, the words followed him like footsteps down the hall. She lingers, not in life, but in pigment, and now in his dreams, the woman began to speak. The collector's descent. The collector tried to anchor himself in routine.
He brewed his morning coffee answered correspondence and handled clients' inquiries with professional polish. Yet beneath the surface, the crimson seeped into everything. Even the simplest tasks bore the weight of her gaze. He would glance up from his desk, only to find the woman in the portrait staring past him, eyes fixed on something just beyond his shoulder. He stopped inviting guests into his study. Once, when a colleague had come to view his acquisitions, the man remarked almost casually, "Strange painting that one. The eyes seem wet, fresh." The collector had hurriedly changed the subject, but the words burrowed deep. Nights grew longer. He read Ashcroft's letters again and again until he could recite them from memory. Each phrase seemed to shift meaning with repetition, as if the text itself breathed. He began to dream in fragments of crimson hallways, bleeding into dark corridors, a woman's silhouette standing in doorways, her mouth open but soundless. He woke drenched in sweat, the letters clenched in his hand. Unable to bear the silence, he returned to Dr. Havers. She welcomed him with cautious curiosity, noting the fatigue etched into his features. "You've gone pale," she said. "Are you well?" He slid the letters across her desk. "You need to read these." Haver's eyes scanned the pages, her expression tightening. "If these are authentic, they suggest something close to ritual practice. Blood and paint, Clara Whitcomb, this is not mere eccentricity." The collector leaned forward. "He confesses. He says the portrait holds her essence, that it lingers." Havers closed the folder. "Do you know what scholars whispered of Ashcroft? That his subjects vanished. Not all, but enough to rouse suspicion. Yet nothing could ever be proved. It was dismissed as rumor. And now you have the only surviving portrait." The weight of her words pressed into him. "Then what am I to do?" Havers sighed. "Document."
Investigate, but tread carefully. Men who chase ghosts sometimes forget the living. That evening, determined to assert control, the collector placed the painting in storage. He sealed it in a climate-controlled vault away from his home. He told himself he would not see it again until he understood what Ashcroft had truly done, but absence did not quiet her. Within days, the dreams worsened. The woman's voice emerged faintly, a thread of sound woven through sleep. At first, it was indistinct, but then it sharpened. A single phrase repeated, "Find Clara." He woke with the taste of copper on his tongue, as though he had bitten it through. His lips, however, were unbroken. Driven by this command, he pursued every trace of Clara Whitcomb. Genealogical records yielded nothing. Church archives had gaps where her name should have been. It was as if someone had deliberately erased her from history. One night in the university archives, he found an old pamphlet, The Whitcomb Affair, a scandal sheet from 1879. The headline read, "Young Woman Disappears. Family Silent." The article was short, vague, and brimming with innuendo. Clara Whitcomb, it said, was last seen entering the studio of an unnamed artist Witnesses claimed to hear raised voices, a woman's cry, and then silence. No charges were filed. The Whitcomb family refused comment. The matter evaporated. The collector's blood ran cold. The unnamed artist needed no name. He returned home, his mind storming with fragments of her life, her erasure, her absorption into pigment. And though the portrait was miles away, he felt it pressing against the edges of his mind. That night, sleep claimed him quickly. And in the dream, the woman stepped fully into view. She was pale, her dress torn, her mouth stained red as though with paint.
She lifted her hand, and in her palm lay a key, old rusted its bow, carved in the shape of an A. When he reached for it, she whispered again, "Find Slara." He woke with his hand clenched tight. For a fleeting moment, he believed he would find the key within his grasp. Instead, his fingers held nothing but air, yet the indentation remained in his palm, as though something heavy had pressed into his flesh while he slept. The descent was complete. What had begun as curiosity had become obsession, and obsession had become command. The painting was not merely pigment on canvas, it was an unfinished sentence demanding an ending, and the collector, whether willing or not, was already writing it. The restorer's eye. The collector realized he needed another set of eyes, not a historian, not a scholar with a head full of dusty records, but someone who understood the language of paint itself.
If Ashcroft had hidden Clara Whitcomb in pigment, only a restorer could unearth her. He knew exactly whom to call. Isabella Raines had a reputation in London's art world, a restorer who treated canvases not as relics, but as living patients. Her workshop smelled of turpentine and beeswax, lit by narrow skylights that poured thin bands of gold across rows of wounded paintings awaiting her touch. Some said she could coax color back from the dead. Others whispered she had uncovered things best left buried. When the collector entered her studio with the crate, she raised an eyebrow. "You've brought me trouble, haven't you?" He forced a smile. "Perhaps I need you to look beneath the surface." Rains slid on gloves, pried open the crate, and lifted the crimson portrait into the light. For a moment, her bravado faltered. She leaned in close, studying the canvas with narrowed eyes. "This is alive," she murmured. "The craquelure doesn't behave as it should."
See, the cracks moved differently across her face, almost as though resisting age. And the red this red is unnatural. The collector hesitated, then pulled Ashcroft's letters from his satchel. He did not give her the second letter, in which blood was confessed. Some truths he still kept close, but he let her read enough to understand. Her face paled. If he did what this suggests, then the portrait isn't just paint, it's a binding. A binding. She met his eyes. Artists through history dabbled in superstition, mixing hair ash, even bone, into pigment. But blood, that's more than superstition. It makes the work personal, symbiotic. For hours, she worked beneath magnification lamps, her tools glinting as she scraped and swabbed. She revealed underlayers invisible to the naked eye, faint outlines of different poses, strokes painted over faces half buried. "There are at least 3 iterations," she said. He couldn't settle. He kept painting over her.
The collector leaned closer. In the infrared scan, faint writing appeared along the lower edge, words hidden beneath layers of crimson glaze. "Clara shall not." The rest was smothered as though Ashcroft himself had silenced it.
Rains took a break, rubbing her temples. "You need to understand, this painting doesn't want to be touched. The varnish resists solvent in ways I've never seen, and every time I peel a layer back, it feels wrong, like peeling skin." The collector, unsettled, muttered, "Then maybe that's what it is." Her eyes hardened. If you're right, if this is what I think it is, then the woman isn't just painted. She's trapped, and every attempt to restore her risks tearing her further apart. That night, the collector dreamt not of the crimson woman, but of Isabella Raines. He saw her hunched over the portrait, her hands trembling, her eyes widening as the brushstrokes shifted beneath her scalpel. The painted woman reached out her hand, slipping past the surface, grasping Isabella's wrist. He woke to a phone call. It was Raines. You need to come now. Her studio was in chaos. The painting stood on an easel, its surface half stripped, the crimson layers removed in patches. What remained beneath made the collector stagger back. It wasn't one woman, it was many, faces upon faces, half finished and abandoned, peering through like ghosts trapped in amber, eyes, mouths, outlines of hands, all painted and painted over, never released. But in the very center, one face remained whole, pale, sorrowful, unmistakably Clara Whitcomb. Raines's voice shook. Do you see? He couldn't escape her. No matter how many times he tried to bury her under others, she returned. And now she's staring straight at us.
The collector's throat tightened. The dreams, the letters, the whispers all led here. Clara was still waiting. Rains stepped closer, lowering her voice. You need to decide. Do we strip her free, or do we leave her buried where Ashcroft intended? The collector felt the weight of the choice press down like a stone. To release her was to risk inviting something neither of them could control. To leave her was to abandon the truth he had already promised himself to find. And in that silence, he heard it again, soft, insistent, unmistakable. Find Clara. The haunting of the restorer. The night after Clara Whitcomb's face was revealed, Isabella Raines refused to leave her studio. She claimed she needed to monitor the portrait as though the paint itself might shift in her absence. The collector offered to stay, but she insisted on solitude, her stubborn pride shielding her from fear. Still, the collector could not sleep. He paced his study, rereading Ashcroft's letters until the ink blurred. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's uncovered face, pale, mournful, pressing through layers of crimson like a body rising through ice. At dawn, his phone rang. Isabella's voice was clipped, hurried, You'd better come. Something happened. The studio reeked of turpentine when he arrived. Canvases leaned against walls at uneasy angles, and the skylights admitted a weak gray light that made every shadow seem alive. Rain stood by the easel, her eyes bloodshot. She gestured to the portrait. The crimson glaze that she had carefully stripped the night before had returned, not entirely, but in streaks and smears across Clara's face, as though the canvas had repainted itself while the world slept. Do you see? Rains whispered. I left it clean, perfect, but it's fighting me. The collector leaned close. The paint was fresh, still tacky. He recoiled as if burned. Impossible. Rains shook her head. I didn't touch it, but all night I heard her, at first faint, then clearer. A woman's voice begging to be released. I thought I was losing my mind. Then I saw her lips move. The collector's stomach knotted. Lips Rains fixed him with hollow eyes. She spoke through the paint. She said my name. That evening, despite her exhaustion, Rains agreed to try again. She worked with trembling hands, solvents and swabs, stripping away the crimson veil. The collector watched his nerves stretch thin, every scrape sounding like a scream. When Clara's face emerged again, the room chilled, the air pressed down heavy as though the studio had sunk under water. Clara's eyes, rendered in exquisite detail by Ashcroft's brush, gleamed wetly. Rains dropped her tool. She's watching us. The collector almost believed it.
They left the studio in silence. Yet later that night, Rains called again, her voice trembling. "It's in my flat now," she said. "The sound, the whisper. I hear her in the walls." The collector clenched the phone. "Isabella, you need rest. Step away." But she only laughed short, brittle. "Rest." She doesn't allow it. She follows. I close my eyes, and Clara is behind them. I open them, and she's there too. She's bleeding through me. The line went dead. At dawn, the collector rushed to her flat. The door was ajar. Inside, the air smelled of linseed oil and iron. On the floor lay her tools, scattered like bones. He found Rains curled in a chair, her hands clutching her temples. When she lifted her head, her eyes were red rimmed, her skin pale. "She's in me," she whispered. "Every time I breathe, I feel her pressing against my chest. She wants out. She wants." Her words broke into sobs.
The collector stood helpless, staring at the woman who had dared to peel back Ashcroft's layers. It was clear now restoration had come at a cost. Clara Whitcomb had not been freed, she had been provoked, and Isabella Rains was her first vessel. That night, back in his own home, the collector lit every lamp determined to resist the dark, but the shadows moved anyway. He swore he saw a figure in the corner of his study, pale faced, crimson stained, watching with patient eyes, and when he closed his own, the whisper followed him, not in dreams, but in waking. "Find Clara." The plea had changed. Now it was sharper, urgent, tinged with anger. The collector knew then that the haunting would not stop with Isabella. Clara's voice was spreading, and Ashcroft's masterpiece was no longer just a painting, it was a contagion. The collector's nightmares asleep became a battleground.
The collector, once comforted by his fortress of books and canvases, now found his own home, far in each corner, pulsing with unseen breath. When exhaustion finally dragged him under, dreams came not as random fragments, but as stage performances, each more vivid than life itself. He stood in Ashcroft's studio, 19th century oil lamps sputtering against soot-darkened walls. The air smelled of blood iron and turpentine. Easels rose like skeletal sentinels, and on every canvas the same woman stared back, Clara Whitcomb, her expression shifting from pleading to accusatory, her eyes following him wherever he moved. He tried to step closer to one canvas, but the paint rippled like water. Clara's hand pushed outward from the surface, her fingers slick with crimson. She whispered, not in agony, but in command, "Find me, finish what he started." The collector jolted awake in his bed, drenched in sweat, the whisper echoing in his skull.
But worse than the sound was the smell oil paint, sharp and metallic, hanging in his real room. He turned on every light, searching only to find smears of red pigment on his sheets, staining his palms. Layers. By day, he tried to bury himself in rational work. He pored over auction records, genealogical databases, anything to tether himself to facts. Yet the facts only deepened his dread. Each reference to Clara Whitcomb ended abruptly, as though a careful hand had erased her from history. Where families had pages of records, Clara's line vanished in a blank gap. And in that absence, the nightmares grew stronger. One night, he found himself inside the crimson portrait itself. He stood where Clara had stood, frozen in her stiff posture, while Ashcroft painted with feverish strokes. The brush dipped not into pigment, but into a basin of dark red liquid. Ashcroft muttered to himself, voice hollow with obsession. You will live forever.
You will not abandon me. When the collector tried to move, he realized his hands were bound to the canvas, his skin tightening into paint. He screamed, but his voice flattened into silence, swallowed by varnish. Clara turned her painted head toward him, her lips moving slowly. Now you see. He woke with his own voice, raw throat aching fingernails, caked with crimson flakes he could not explain. By the third week, he no longer trusted the boundary between dream and waking. Objects shifted on his desk. The clock ticked backwards. Sometimes in the corner of his eye, Clara's reflection appeared in the glass of a cabinet or the darkened screen of his computer. Desperate, he reached out to Isabella Raines again. She answered in a whisper, her voice nearly broken. I can't. I can't look at it anymore, she said. The portrait, it doesn't stay in the studio. It comes with me. When I eat, when I sleep, her face is there.
My own reflection bends into hers. Do you understand? I'm losing myself. The collector pressed the phone tighter. We need to stop. We need to put it away. But Rains only laughed softly, a hollow, eerie sound. Put it away. You don't put away a soul, darling. You finish it or it finishes you. The line cut off. That night, the collector dreamed of Clara again. But this time, Ashcroft was not the painter. He was. His own hands held the brush, his own voice whispered the incantations, and Clara smiled faintly, as though approving. He woke with the brush from his desk in his hand, its tip dripping red. On the canvas beside his bed, a canvas he swore had been blank lines had begun to appear. The faint outline of a woman's face, Clara's hauteur. The nightmares were no longer confined to sleep. They were seeping into waking hours, infiltrating his life like a parasite.
He had thought himself the collector of paintings, the curator of forgotten works, but now he understood the reversal. He was the one being collected. The mask behind the crimson. The collector began to keep notes not for scholarship, but for survival. Each morning he wrote down what he had seen in the night, convinced that if he did not record it, the dreams would consume him completely. His journal filled with sketches of Clara's face, words written in a scrawl he barely recognized as his own. Sometimes entire passages appeared without memory of having written them. Phrases like the mask must break and she waits beneath the red. It was not just dreams anymore. The world itself was shifting. One afternoon, while revisiting the library, he stumbled across a portrait in a reference book, a preliminary sketch of a woman by Arthur Ashcroft. The sitter's features were softer, her smile hesitant.
Beneath the caption, one word was written in faded ink, Clara. But what caught his attention was not the resemblance, it was the absence. The eyes in the sketch had been deliberately erased, gouged out with such force that the page tore. Someone had tried to strip Clara of her gaze, her very power. The collector closed the book quickly, but even then he felt her eyes upon him, not drawn, not painted real, watching. He went back to Isabella's studio. She hadn't returned his calls for days. The door was locked, the windows covered, but when he pressed his ear to the wood, he heard movement inside, soft, rhythmic. He knocked, then pounded. Finally, the door creaked open. Isabella stood there, her face pale, her eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. He looked past her into the room. The portrait loomed larger than before, propped against the wall without its frame, its edges raw and frayed. Layers of crimson still clung stubbornly, but patches of Clara's face gleamed through, too vivid, too alive. She's almost free, Isabella murmured, as though in a trance. The collector stepped closer. What do you mean? Isabella's hand trembled as she pointed. Ashcroft didn't just paint her, he buried her. Every layer a mask. And every mask hides not just Clara, but others, women who came before. The crimson is their prison. The collector froze. Others? Yes. Her voice cracked. You saw it too, the faces underneath. They're not sketches, they're real. He consumed them, he painted them into silence. That night, the collector stared at his own reflection in the dark window of his study. For a heartbeat, his features blurred, shifting into Clara's face, then into another woman's, then another. Each visage pale, pleading, swallowed by red. The truth was unbearable. Clara was not alone. The portrait was a mausoleum of stolen lives, their voices layered one atop the other until only she remained strong enough to surface. And Ashcroft, Arthur Ashcroft, had been the executioner and the jailer, binding his victims not with rope, but with brush and pigment. The collector wrote in his journal, until dawn, the crimson is the mask hides the dead. To find Clara, the mask must be broken. But breaking it meant risk. The whispers grew harsher, angrier. Clara's voice was no longer gentle. It pressed against him with urgency, a demand. He felt her in his chest, pushing just as Isabella had described. He called Isabella again, but her phone only rang. When he returned to her studio the next day, the portrait was gone. The easel stood bare, tools, scattered turpentine bottles, overturned. Pinned to the wall was a single scrap of canvas, torn from the painting's edge. Scrawled across it in red pigment, finger painted, not brushed, were the words, "The mask will not hold." The collector staggered back, cold rushing through him. He understood then that Clara was closer to freedom than ever before, and Isabella was no longer resisting her. Somewhere in the city, the portrait had left its resting place, and with it, the boundaries between paint and flesh were collapsing. The restorer's disappearance. The city was restless that week, as if it too felt the tremor of something stirring beneath its streets. The collector wandered aimlessly, hunting for Isabella, following whispers and hints through cafes, alleyways, and old art circles where her name was once revered. But every door he knocked on only opened to silence, and every call he made fell into the void. Then came the message, slipped beneath his apartment door, folded twice with clinical precision. The envelope was smudged with streaks of red, not paint, not ink, but something that clung damply to his fingers. Inside was a single photograph, Isabella seated before the portrait, her head tilted to one side, eyes wide and unfocused. Behind her, Clara's face pressed outward from the canvas lips, parted as though breathing. No signature, no explanation, only a second note scrawled across the back. The mask is breaking. He turned the city upside down, called hospitals, visited every gallery she had ever worked with. Nothing. Isabella had simply dissolved as if the earth itself had claimed her. But then in the attic of the Ashcroft estate, now little more than a gutted ruin, he found her trace. Dust lay heavy across the floorboards, except for one corridor of disturbed footprints leading to a locked storage room. The collector forced the rusted door and stepped into the dark. There in the center of the room sat Isabella's satchel, brushes spilled from its side, their bristles stiff with hardened red. Her sketchbook lay open on the floor pages, torn with frantic strokes. The drawings inside were of Clara, but not the Clara he had come to know. These were monstrous, distorted, her face fractured into shards, her smile stretched too wide, her eyes painted as gaping hollows, and across every page, written over and over in Isabella's hand, she asked for my eyes. The collector's pulse thundered. He whispered Isabella's name, but the room returned only silence. Then faintly a sound, not footsteps, not the groan of wood, a humming, low, tuneless, like a child trying to recall a melody. He followed it to the far wall where an empty frame leaned crookedly against the bricks. Beneath it, smeared in wet crimson, was the outline of a handprint.
He reached out his own hand, trembling as it hovered above the stain. The humming grew louder, not from the wall, from inside his head. Clara's voice weaving with others, hundreds, maybe thousands, rising in a cacophony of longing and rage. Isabella was gone, taken into the canvas or perhaps beyond it. And now the portrait no longer waited in studios or hidden storage. It was moving, hunting, Marmor. That night, the collector could not sleep. The last page of Isabella's sketchbook burned in his mind, the words etched deep enough to scar him. When the mask breaks, she will wear another, perhaps mine, perhaps yours. The coded melody. The collector returned to his apartment with Isabella's sketchbook pressed tight against his chest, the satchel slung over his shoulder like contraband.
He spread its contents across his table under the yellow bulb of his desk lamp, examining every brushstroke, every frantic scribble. Her drawings swam with feverish repetition, faces melting eyes, gouged mouths, open in eternal silence. And yet, amid the chaos, he noticed a strange order patterns hidden in her sketches, like symbols repeating in the shadows of Clara's features. The repetition wasn't accidental. Isabella, in her final days, had not merely gone mad. She had seen something, and she had tried to map it. That night, he pulled out a magnifying glass, tracing each jagged stroke. The patterns were too deliberate, aligning like a score of music bars and notes hidden in charcoal. He had never learned to read music, but even a novice could see rhythm carved in these shapes. Isabella had encoded a melody within her sketches. When he flipped back through earlier notebooks, ones she had left years before, he realized the same motif surfaced again and again, faint but persistent, a haunting tune threading through her career. It was as though Clara had been whispering in Isabella's ear for decades, long before she restored the painting. But why a melody? Why music in a world of brushes and oils? He returned to the Ashcroft estate, this time under moonlight. The building sagged with decay ivy strangling its windows, the smell of damp plaster clinging to its bones. He carried a flashlight and Isabella's notebook. His instincts guided him to the studio where the portrait had once hung. The walls were bare now, but when he shined his light at the cracked plaster, the faintest shimmer glimmered beneath the surface like paint absorbed deep into stone. He scraped gently with a palette knife, and flakes of plaster crumbled to the ground.
Beneath them, hidden in a long horizontal strip, were faded lines of music notation painted directly into the wall. The staff, the notes, the strange symbols, all disguised as part of the underlayer of the studio's walls. Ashcroft had hidden something. The collector copied the sequence into a notebook, careful not to miss a mark. He traced the notes by hand, his fingers trembling. Later in his apartment, he took the page to an old piano in the corner, a relic from his grandmother. Dust coated its keys, but the strings inside still resonated faintly. He pressed the first key. The sound was low, guttural, too low for the note written. He pressed the second, then the third. Each tone came out wrong, bending strangely as though the piano itself rejected the melody. But the sequence persisted, and when played through to the end, something happened. The room vibrated, the lamp flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally long against the walls, and then faintly a voice. Do you hear me now? The collector staggered back from the piano. The voice wasn't Isabella's, wasn't Clara's. It was layered, fractured, a chorus of dozens, speaking as one, vibrating in the marrow of his bones. Mama murmur har mamar. He clutched Isabella's sketchbook, turning to the page. Marked with her final note, she asked for my eyes. Beneath it, almost invisible in the pencil's faded gray, was an additional line he hadn't noticed before. He angled it under the lamplight, and the words surfaced like a ghost. The melody unlocks the frame. Unlocks. It meant the portrait itself. Ashcroft had left a code, and Isabella had deciphered it in her final hours. The melody was not simply sound, it was a key designed to unbind Clara from her canvas prison. The collector's throat dried as realization set in. Isabella hadn't been taken because she failed to resist Clara. She had been taken because she had succeeded. She had played the code. She had unlocked the frame, and now Clara walked free. Mane apesirdim. But where and why leave fragments behind? Why hum to him in the attic? Why the photograph slipped beneath his door? Clara could move unseen, but she wanted him to follow. She wanted him to find. The coded melody was no longer simply a warning. It was an invitation. The collector sat in silence, the piano still vibrating with the last note. He closed Isabella's sketchbook, his fingers leaving smears of dust and dried red pigment across the cover. Somewhere in the city, Clara moved among the living, seeking her next mask. The painting might still exist, but she no longer needed it to tether her. He realized with a bone-deep chill that Ashcroft's genius had not been the portrait itself, but the trap he had constructed around it, a trap meant to contain something ancient, something that had only borrowed Clara's beauty to lure its keeper. Now that trap was breaking, and the collector, armed with Isabella's final sketches and Ashcroft's coded melody, was the only one left who could either seal it again or let it devour everything. The night pressed in on him, heavy and cold. He whispered Isabella's name one last time into the stillness, as though she might answer through the silence. But only the echo of Clara's fractured chorus returned. Do you hear me now? And for the first time, he wondered if he had been chosen not as a hunter, but as the next frame. The circle's shadow. The city seemed to change after the melody. Street lamps flickered longer at dusk. Shop windows cast warped reflections, and the collector began to notice faces in crowds that lingered too long on him, as though recognizing him. He carried Isabella's sketchbook everywhere, clutched like scripture, his thumb pressed against her scrawled warning, "The melody unlocks the frame." He knew now that Clara was loose, but what he did not yet understand was why Ashcroft had left behind clues at all. Artists, he told himself, worked in layers, and Ashcroft was a master. Perhaps the melody was never meant for Clara. It was meant for those who came after. A warning system, a summons. That thought haunted him until one rainy afternoon when a stranger appeared. The collector was sitting in a cafe, notes scattered across the table when the man slid into the chair opposite him. His suit was dated, his shoes scuffed, but his eyes, pale gray, unwavering, seemed carved from stone. "You've played it," the man said flatly. The collector froze. Played what? The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. The melody. Don't lie. Once it's heard, it marks you. That's why she lingers near you now.
Why she watches? The collector felt the room tilt. His first instinct was denial, but the certainty in the stranger's tone drained him of words. The man produced a thin envelope, sliding it across the table. You've stumbled into something older than you know. Ashcroft wasn't alone. He belonged to a circle, a covenant sworn to hold her inside the canvas. We failed once before. We cannot fail again. Back in his apartment, the collector tore open the envelope. Inside were photographs brittle with age, a gathering of men and women in formal attire standing before the crimson portrait in its earliest days. Ashcroft was among them, his expression gaunt but proud. Around him stood others, their names scrawled on the back in faded ink: Blackwell, Herrick, Dumas, Linford, the Circle. The photograph chilled him, but what unsettled him more was a second image, the same group 20 years later, smaller now, faces weary. The portrait behind them altered. Clara's face was less serene, more strained, as though pressing harder against the surface. Beneath the photo, a note written in a trembling hand: The mask demands renewal. The collector's mind reeled. Isabella's drawings, Ashcroft's melody, the whispering voice, they were all part of this lineage of guardianship. The circle had known Clara wasn't simply a subject. She was a vessel for something ancient, something that needed containment. They had bound her into the painting, but like all bindings, it weakened with time. And when the mask broke, it required another. That night, the collector spread the photographs across his table. He noticed something chilling. One name had been circled in red Herrick.
In the margins of Isabella's sketchbook, the same name appeared scrawled faintly beside a sketch of hollow eyes. Had Isabella met one of them before her disappearance, or had Herrick himself guided her restoration work, nudging her closer to Clara's release? If so, then perhaps the circle wasn't a covenant of protectors anymore. Perhaps some among them had betrayed their oath. Sigh. Unable to rest, the collector visited the city archives requesting records of the Ashcroft estate. Buried in boxes of correspondence, he discovered a letter addressed to the Circle of Stained Hands. Its contents were cryptic. When the frame fails, the melody must be played again. To close what was opened, another vessel must be chosen. Without it, she will walk freely and none will be safe. The letter was signed with a symbol, not a name, a circle drawn in black ink, inside of which was a red smear shaped like a palm, the circle of stained hands. That night, the collector couldn't escape the weight of the phrase, another vessel must be chosen. Isabella had been drawn into Clara's grip, not because she was weak, but because she had been marked as the next mask. Perhaps willingly, perhaps unwillingly, she had been the sacrifice the circle demanded. And now, with Isabella gone, the melody resonated inside the collector himself. He was next. As the rain battered against his window, he thought of the stranger in the cafe, of Herrick's circled name, of Clara's whisper echoing inside his skull. Somewhere in the city, remnants of the circle still lingered, watching, guiding, or betraying. But what chilled him most was the final line scribbled in the margin of Isabella's sketchbook, written so faintly he hadn't seen it until now, when the lamplight struck at the right angle. If you seek the truth, find them.
But beware, the circle no longer agrees on who deserves saving. Martibaziai And in that moment, the collector understood the portrait was never simply about art or Clara or even Ashcroft. It was about a pact sealed generations ago and now cracking open. The circle's shadow was everywhere, and he had just stepped into the center of it. The melody played. The invitation came folded into a piece of sheet music slipped beneath his apartment door at dusk. No envelope this time, no cryptic photograph, just a single page with black bars and notes written in a hand that trembled with age. Across the margin was scrawled, "Tonight, play and we will answer." The collector sat frozen at his table, Isabella's sketchbook lying open before him. Ashcroft's coded melody still etched in his mind. The message bore no name, but he knew who it came from. The Circle, the shadowed guardians who had both bound Clara and betrayed her. They had been watching him ever since he first pressed his fingers to the piano. Now they wanted him to play again, and he feared what would happen if he did.
The meeting took place in an abandoned theater on the city's edge, its velvet seats eaten by moths, its curtains sagging with mildew. The collector crept through the aisles with the sheet of music trembling in his hand, his shoes crunching broken glass underfoot. The stage lights flickered once, and figures emerged from the dark. 3 of them. Their suits were old-fashioned, their collars frayed their faces gaunt. Yet their eyes burned with the same pale certainty as the stranger in the cafe. "You carry Ashcroft's melody," one said. His voice rasped like old parchment. "You carry Isabella's final notes. You have been marked." The collector swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" The second figure, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe knot, spoke next. "Not from you, through you. Clara has slipped her frame. We must return her. You must play." The third leaned forward, voice low conspiratorial. "Unless you prefer, she takes you instead." They led him to the stage. At its center stood an upright piano, warped with age but still intact. Its keys gleamed faintly under the dim spotlight. Upon its music stand sat the sheet he had been given, the continuation of Ashcroft's code expanded into a full composition. The collector's hands trembled as he placed the notes before him. He thought of Isabella, her frantic sketches, her last desperate scribbles. "She asked for my eyes." He thought of Clara's voice, fractured and many whispering from the portrait, "Do you hear me now?" And he thought of the circle itself. Were they truly keepers or only predators waiting for the next sacrifice? Oh, Azizrai. He pressed the first key. The sound bled through the theater, thick and wrong, vibrating in his teeth. The circle leaned forward, watching. He played the second, then the third, each note unraveling the silence into something darker. Shadows gathered along the walls, rippling as though stirred by water. By the 10th note, the air thickened, breathless. The collector's hands shook, yet he continued, compelled by a force larger than himself. The melody was no longer his to resist. It pulled him forward, note after note, dragging him deeper into its design. And then the stage groaned. The wooden floor split. A shape rose through the cracks. A canvas tall and cracked its frame, rotting its surface, blistered with age.
The crimson portrait, Clara's painted face, stared out, her eyes alive with hunger, her lips curling into something between a smile and a scream. The circle members dropped to their knees. One whispered, "The frame lives again." But Clara's gaze was fixed not on them, on him. The collector faltered. His fingers hovered above the keys, but the melody demanded completion. The notes, still remaining, glowed faintly on the page, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Finish it," the woman urged. Seal her. Do it now. Or the third hissed, let her choose you. A new vessel, a stronger mask. The collector realized with a coldness that hollowed him that this was the circle's true purpose. Not guardians, not saviors, but arbiters of sacrifice. Each cycle, one among them or one chosen by them, played the melody to bind Clara again, to feed her, to keep the curse alive. Isabella had been their chosen vessel before him, and now they wanted him to decide. Shame. He stared at the portrait. Clara's painted eyes shimmered alive with pleading. In them he saw not only hunger, but despair, as though beneath the mask lay something deeper, older, begging for release. The collector's chest ached. He could seal her back into the canvas, continuing the circle's cycle, or he could stop, break the melody, and risk unleashing her fully. The choice burned in his bones, and then Clara spoke, her voice echoing through the theater, soft but unyielding. They caged me. You can free me. Choose. The collector's hands hovered above the final chords. The circle leaned forward, waiting, their eyes glinting with fanatic hunger. The portrait throbbed with life, Clara pressing against its surface. He closed his eyes and struck the keys. The final chord shattered through the theater, reverberating like thunder. The lights blew out. The stage cracked open. The portrait convulsed its frame, glowing red, Clara's scream filling the cavernous hall as shadows whipped outward. The circle cried out in triumph or terror he could not tell, and then silence. When the collector opened his eyes, the portrait stood whole again, Clara's face frozen mid-scream, her hand pressed outward against the glass of her painted world. The circle exhaled as one. The seal is renewed, the woman whispered, but the collector knew the truth. The seal had not renewed, it had shifted, and something inside the portrait had changed. The collapse, the silence that followed was suffocating. Dust hung in the air like fog catching faint light from the broken fixtures overhead. The collector sat frozen at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys. The final chord reverberated in his bones, echoing long after the sound itself had died.
On the stage before him, the crimson portrait quivered faintly in its frame as if alive. Clara's painted eyes bulged with the strain, her lips parted mid-scream, her hands pressed outward against the canvas. For a heartbeat, he thought she might burst free, her body tearing through the painted surface like flesh. But then she stilled, trapped again. The circle exhaled in unison. Relief washed over their faces like a holy benediction. One of them whispered, the seal holds. Another added, the vessel bends, but it does not break. Their words made the collector's stomach churn. He realized now what had really happened. He had not renewed the seal. He had redirected it. Clara's prison had shifted its power, tethered not just to the canvas, but to him. The final note had not only closed her in it, had bound their fates together. That night, the circle gathered around him, their pale faces glowing with triumph. Ashcroft would be proud, said the woman with the silver hair. You've ensured another cycle. The world is safe. The collector recoiled. Safe, his voice cracked, hoarse from fear. Isabella is gone. Clara is still alive inside that thing. And now, he pressed a trembling hand to his chest. Now I feel her here, breathing through me. The man with gray eyes stepped forward, his stare hard as stone. That is the cost. The vessel is never free. It carries her shadow until the cycle demands another. You've accepted your place. The circle welcomes you. The words chilled him more than Clara's whispers. He left the theater that night, staggering into the rain, Isabella's sketchbook pressed tightly under his coat. Behind him, the circle murmured prayers or curses. He could not tell the difference. The city streets blurred lights, smearing into streaks as his vision faltered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's face, not painted, not trapped.
Alive, pressed against the inside of his skull. You chose them, she hissed in his mind. You chose the cage. You chose me. His reflection in shop windows looked wrong. His mouth moved without sound. His eyes twitched with shadows that were not his own. He was slipping. Days blurred into nights. The collector stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He pored through Isabella's notes, through Ashcroft's fragmented codes, trying to find another way to undo what he had done. But the sketches mocked him now. Every page seemed to shift when he looked away, faces warping notes, changing Clara's painted smile, curling wider. He began hearing music at odd hours, not from the piano, not from outside, from inside his skull. A melody played on endless loop notes bending into screams. And then came the dreams. In them he stood before the portrait. Clara reached out to him, not with malice, but with tenderness.
She touched his cheek and whispered we could end them all. The circle, the prison, the lies. Let me out. Each time he woke drenched in sweat, her touch still burning on his skin. The circle, too, began to fracture. He saw it in their eyes, during clandestine meetings, in ruined buildings and candlelit halls. Some were satisfied with the seal renewed. Others whispered that Clara grew stronger, each cycle hungrier, that their control was waning. Arguments flared, trust frayed. The word betrayal lingered unspoken in the air like smoke. The collector realized the circle's unity was crumbling, and when it broke, the world might break with it. The tipping point came one night when he returned to his apartment to find his walls defaced. The circle's symbol, a black ring with a red palm smeared in its center, had been painted over his door, his mirror, his floorboards.
He dropped Isabella's sketchbook and staggered back, his chest heaving. Voices rose in his head, layered and countless, not just Clara's, but others who had lived and died through her curse. One mask breaks, another wears, the seal consumes, the seal lies, and then a knock at the door. When he opened it, no one stood there, only a bloodied envelope torn at the corners, the contents smeared and wet. Inside a photograph, the circle themselves gathered around the portrait, but now Clara's painted face was gone. The frame was empty. The collector's breath seized. Clara was no longer confined, not even within the paint. She had moved, perhaps into him, perhaps into the shadows. The seal was collapsing. The circle's rituals no longer worked as intended. For the first time, he understood Isabella's desperate scrawl. She asked for my eyes. Clara didn't want another mask. She wanted freedom. And maybe he thought, with a tremor of horror and longing, she wanted it through him. The walls around him pulsed as if alive, the red handprints glowing faintly in the dark. The air thickened, and the collector fell to his knees, clutching his head. The cycle was ending, and the collapse had begun. The reckoning. The city groaned beneath a storm that night. Rain hammered the rooftops, lightning carved white scars across the sky, and thunder rattled the glass panes in their frames. The collector wandered through the streets, Isabella's sketchbook soaked beneath his coat, the weight of Clara's presence pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Inside his skull, the whispers had grown deafening, not just Clara anymore, but the chorus of every voice she had consumed, layer upon layer of broken songs. They clashed, argued, begged, threatened. Yet Clara's own tone cut through them, velvet and commanding. Do not run from me. I am not your enemy. The circle is. Her words clung to him. He wanted to dismiss them as manipulation, yet each time he remembered the faces of the circle, gray eyed zealots, gaunt guardians clinging to their ritual of blood and sacrifice. He hesitated. They claimed to protect the world, but the truth, they only prolonged her imprisonment. They had fed her with lives, year after year, mask after mask, binding her hunger but never breaking it. And now she wanted him to finish what Isabella could not. The summons came at midnight, a knock at his door 3 times sharp, followed by silence. He opened it to find not a messenger, but a trail of wet footprints leading down the hall. No body cast them, just the marks themselves, glowing faintly red in the stormlight. He followed them without thinking, each step dragging him deeper into the city's underbelly. The trail ended at the abandoned cathedral. Its spires bent, its stained glass shattered, its altar desecrated by time, and yet candlelight flickered within, leaking through cracks in the heavy doors. Inside, the circle waited.
They stood in a semicircle before the altar, the crimson portrait propped against its base. Clara's painted form writhed inside her features, blurred, unfinished, as though mid transformation. The gray eyed man stepped forward. You have brought her this far. Now you must end it. The silver haired woman's voice cracked like ice play again. Seal her. Complete the work before she devours you. The collector's gaze shifted from their gaunt faces to Clara's flickering image. She wasn't screaming now, she was pleading. Her hand pressed not outward, but upward toward him. They will never free me. Her voice whispered in his head. They need me bound, but you, only you can choose.
He took a step closer, his shoes echoing in the hollow cathedral. The circle's voices rose. Do it, seal her, save us. And then Clara spoke again softly, almost human. Save me. The collector's pulse hammered. He felt Isabella's presence hovering her sketches, heavy in his hand, her frantic words repeating. She asked for my eyes. Perhaps Isabella had seen what he saw, now that Clara was not only a monster, but also a prisoner, that perhaps the greater evil was not her hunger, but the circle's endless cycle of sacrifice. Lightning split the sky, flooding the cathedral with white light. In that instant, he understood the reckoning was not Clara's, it was his. He stepped to the piano the circle had placed before the altar. The sheet music lay ready, the ink still wet, the same cursed melody waiting. His fingers hovered over the keys, but this time he did not strike them.
He lifted the pages and tore them in half. The circle cried out in outrage, their shouts echoing through the cavernous hall. The gray eyed man rushed forward, but Clara's voice roared like a storm. Enough! The portrait cracked. Splinters shot across the canvas as her painted form strained against its prison. The frame groaned, wood snapping, gilded edges curling outward. Shadows spilled across the cathedral, slamming the circle to their knees. The collector staggered back, light searing through his skull. Clara's voice thundered inside him, burning and cold all at once. You broke their chains. Now choose cage me forever or let me walk free.
The circle screamed for him to play to bind her again, their voices shrill and desperate. Clara's eyes locked with his, her painted body trembling on the edge of release. For one heartbeat, time stood still. He raised his hands, not to play, but to shatter the piano itself, his fists slamming down across the keys, wood splintering strings, snapping in violent discord. The melody ended there, forever. The circle howled in betrayal. Clara laughed. The portrait burst. Shards of canvas and frame erupted into the air like a storm of glass. The cathedral drowned in shadow, the candles extinguished in a single breath. The circle collapsed their bodies, writhing as Clara's power consumed them, dragging them screaming into the dark. The collector fell to his knees, the weight of her presence flooding through him. She was free now, no longer tethered to oil and canvas, free and inside him. Her voice whispered like silk against his ear, "You chose me." He closed his eyes, and for the first time he whispered back, "I did." The silent epilogue, the storm had long passed.
Morning broke pale and fragile over the city, the streets slick with last night's rain, the gutters swollen with debris. A stillness lingered, one that felt less like calm and more like the silence left behind after a scream. The cathedral was gone, collapsed into itself, nothing more than rubble and ash. The circle had vanished with it. No bodies, no bones, no trace of their ritual, but the faint stench of burnt wax and a blackened mark etched into the ground where the portrait once stood. And the collector, he walked among the ruins, his coat torn, his eyes hollow. Inside him, she moved Clara's essence, her whispers threading into his pulse, her laughter faint, almost tender. She had not devoured him, not yet. Instead, she lingered, a shadow stitched to his heartbeat, patient as dusk. Each step he took left the faintest red imprint on the ground, a trace of her that only the attentive would notice. Not blood, not paint, something in between.
Days turned into weeks. He stopped working, stopped speaking. The sketchbook remained on his desk, its pages warped by rain, Isabella's frantic lines dissolving into blurred stains. Sometimes he traced them with his fingers, wondering whether she had been warning him or guiding him. At night, when the city slept, the collector heard the melody, not from a piano, not from strings, but from the walls themselves, from the bones of the buildings, from the air that pressed heavy against his lungs, a song of hunger, of release, of unfinished longing. And always Clara's voice, quieter now, almost intimate, "I am with you. You ended the cycle. You chose me. We are one." People whispered about the fire that consumed the cathedral, about the strange emptiness in the circle's absence, as if a silent order had been broken.
About the man with pale eyes who walked the streets at night carrying silence with him like a cloak. Some claimed to see a woman's shadow at his side, drifting just behind him, in lamplight vanishing when looked at directly. Others said his footsteps carried an echo like a second pair of shoes, clicking faintly beside his own. But no one asked questions aloud, because those who did disappeared. One evening, as the collector sat by his window watching the city fade into twilight, Clara's whisper softened into something almost human. "Paint me." His hand trembled. He reached for the brush, the canvas, the old jar of crimson pigment. He set the first stroke down, then the second. Outside, the bells tolled midnight. Inside, the portrait began again. The silent epilogue closed not with an ending, but with a promise that some stories never finish.
They simply change form, spilling from canvas to flesh, from melody to silence, from one vessel to the next. And the collector, once a man, was now something else, something unfinished, something eternal,